Hello, they're lovely to see so many of you here this afternoon. We're in the car park at the village hall, and I'm going to start by telling you a bit of the history of Down Thomas and how it came about, and then I'll tell you a bit about the farms, and we'll go along from there. So Down Thomas, the only farms that are named properly is Manor Farm and Farm Barton down the other end, and in between they take the names of the previous tenant, or they used to, and they were called Tenements. And I think probably in about the 1200s somebody laid out the village and put 8 farms along the lower side of the road, and they've all got identical little fields at the back, and some of the houses still survive that I will show you. But it belonged to Thomas of Down to start with, and then it went to the Brixton families, or Trichiston. It's a very hard word to say, but it became Brixton anyway, so we'll call them Brixton. And they actually came from Randley, and Randley was a Domesday manor called Brixton. And they were here living in the manor house, and in 1300 they had a licensed chapel there. So, and the chapel was still there until I think the house burnt down in about 18 something, and it was rebuilt in 1814, the manor house, and they used the chapel and everything to rebuild the new house, so the chapel's no more, but it was still there in 1800. Moving on from there, if you look in the back of my car, I've got some maps, and one is the Langdon estate map from about 1790, and the other one is the Sporrel map of about the same date, and they kind of match because what one shows the other one doesn't, and vice versa. And it just shows all the strip fields and how because there was these original tenements in the village, they all had a piece in the open fields like they do still at Thornton Burrows. And Down Thomas was still strip fields right up until 1876. Then Mr. Carmody at Langdon wanted to sell, and the 3 owners got together and divided all the land up into ring fence farms. And until then it was lots of little tenements. And before we had parish councils, we had church councils, and you had the right to appoint an overseer. There were 2 overseers for the parish of Wembury, one from Knighton and Wembury side, and one from Langdon and Down Thomas side. And they were chosen by this ancient order of tenements, and every year it went from tenement over that side to tenement over this side, and they had to perform as the overseers of the poor. And the people who were farming land had to pay penny, tuppence, and went up to several shillings in the end, to pay for the upkeep of the poor. So it was all done quite democratically, and that went on until the poor law and the unions came in and people were sent to the workhouse. But until that, each parish looked after its own poor. And if you came from somewhere else, like my ancestor came here in about 1783 to be the village thatcher. He was called James Horn, and because he came from somewhere else, he had to go before the Justice Lane at Coffleet, and sign a piece of paper to say where he was born, where he was brought up, and which parish he belonged to, just in case he became destitute in Wembury and they would have sent him back to where he came from. So that was how the system worked. Anyway, he did quite well as a thatcher, because the whole of Down Thomas was falling down at that time and it needed repair. Yeah, we'll go back to to the Brixton family. Lived there in the manor, and he had 3 daughters, the last one, and he left Down Thomas to be divided between his 3 daughters. So that was 3 different families. And then the Carmodys came along in 1555 odd, and one brother bought 1 share and his 2 other brothers bought the other share, and then there was 1 share over, and that became to the Coles eventually, Manor Farm, and the Manor of Down Thomas went to the Coles of Slade at Cornwood, and then they eventually sold it to the Cholwiches, also of Cornwood, Cholwich Town. And we've got this ongoing link with Cornwood. I don't know why. My daughter lives in Cornwood, so there's still a link. And yeah, so that was how that came about. And then, of course, the two Langdon parts of Down Thomas didn't stay. As they got hard up, they'd sell a bit and then they'd buy it back and so forth. It chopped and changed. So it gets a little complicated. The Cholwiches sold it in 1765 to the Connell family, and they've got their plaque in Wembury Church. And the Connell daughter eloped with Mr. Prance, William Prance from North Devon, and so then it became the Prance family. So it was in their family from 1795 until 1923, I think, when it was sold and bought by Mr. Sherrill, the farmer. So so I think that's a little bit about the history. Coming back to where we are, we're in the field which was given, originally it was the allotments for Down Thomas, and it belonged to the Giles family who lived in Prince's Farm just across the road. And Mr. Giles gave the field to the community, and then later in 1935 the Reverend Case, who lived at Boverson Lodge, gave the money to build the original Jubilee Hall. So I guess it's King George V's Jubilee, would it be? 1935? That's the date on the end. The extension down the end was built. There was a Miss Downer and Mrs. Trott who lived in Haybrook Bay at the Haven, and they had a little chapel under their house. And for about 30 or 40 years they collected money to build a church in Down Thomas, somewhere for services. And then they eventually, passed away and what have you. But the money was put into building the extension on the village hall so that they could have church services there, which they do, or they don't, or they did. They did, yeah. When we had a vicar. We had a vicar for a long time. So that's a little bit about that. We're going to progress out that way. I should perhaps tell you that Prince's Farm, which was Giles's, which we get to the first one, the land runs out that way towards Haybrook Bay on this side of the road, and Gabber Farm is across the valley there. What you're looking at goes right down that way, and there's not a lot of land left with Manor Farm, but originally it had several tenements, and Rowland was one particularly. If you look across behind Gabber, there's a big field in the wood, and it's all called Rowland Wood, and that went to the manor as well. On the corner here, you'll see behind that signpost, there's a wartime shelter. And years ago there was another farm there called Beers Farm, and nothing left of it now, but that was where it was in there, Beers Farm. And the first cottage here on the end stood alone at one time. That was where the Averys lived. They were masons. Nathaniel Avery lived there. And if you look at it, it's double fronted, whereas the other cottages have only got one single window and a door. So it's bigger than the others. And it once stood alone, and the others were added on later time. The Averys were a big family of them in Wembury and both sides of the parish. And Francis Avery in 1804 was caught smuggling with 3 ponies and contraband going up Tavistock Hill in Plymouth. And he had to go before the magistrates, and all they seemed to do was confiscate his horses and the contraband. And the justice was Mr. Lockyer, and he was brother to Thomas Lockyer, who built Wembury House. So I guess you wonder where the cottage man went, because it was several gallons of rum and sherry and stuff like that. Geneva. What's Geneva? Anybody know that? I would think it might be Madeira or something like that. They called it Geneva in those days. Gin? Gin. Oh, it could be gin, yeah. Whoa, several gallons of gin there was. Yeah, 3 ponies packed up. Anyway, they got caught, so I don't know if he came to anything serious. He just lost his horses. Anyway, we'll progress down the road a little way. I'm saying everything in Down Thomas was thatched, and a lot of it was cob as well. So when the wet got in, the cottages fell down and got into disrepair. And when the comedies came back, there was an absence of about 30 years when there was nobody at Langdon and everything fell into disrepair. So when the new family came along, they did this survey and they priced everything to put it right. And some of the cottages were beyond repair. So I guess they disappeared. But the ones worth saving were repaired. And so this all happened sort of just after 1800. Things sort of got better, but until then there was 30 years when everything was let go. So I was saying on the end of the cottage you can see where it was originally, and then it's been extended, because those would have been thatched originally, I guess. The Methodist chapel, and it's the second one. I'll show you the first one in a minute. This one was built in 1900 and could seat 120 people, and it was a very exciting day in Down Thomas in 1900 when it was opened, and all the dignitaries came, and you can see along the bottom are the names of the people who gave some money for the building of the chapel. And the one on the corner here is R.E. Cox. Now Mr. Cox was a big dairy farmer, and he had 100 cows at Ranlee and 100 cows at Ernesettle and 100 cows at Fardell. And he would have had 5 men on each farm, because a man could milk 20 cows in a go, you know, all in the morning before it had to be delivered around the town. And he started the 3 Towns Dairies in Plymouth. And he said that he liked employing good Christian men because they were good to their employers. That was, he made a speech at the opening of the chapel. And then some of the other ones are the building people who gave the building material. And then there's one there to the Body family. And Mrs. Body was a walk, and there was lots of walks in Wembury and several in Down Thomas. And she married Hart Body at, he was the butcher at Elberton. So they were good Methodist people, and she's got a stone. And on the end is one to the Watts family. And the Watts is, he was the manager at Ranlee for Mr. Cox, and they've been involved in farming around Down Thomas for generations. And he was the secretary or the registrar for this chapel, and he had been, and his father before him, for the old one. So that's a little bit about the chapel. It closed in about 1960. I think the last service was probably 1958, something like that. And then it was eventually, we thought perhaps the C of E was going to buy it, but they didn't want it.
I did Sunday school after we got married, so that was about 71, 72.
Yeah, you're still using it then, yeah.
Yes, it was Church England Sunday school.
Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. You can see all the farms are side by side. This is Prince's farm, and that is Taylor's farm just over the wall, or Stadden Court as it's called now. And that is Manor Farm there, and that's all the buildings of Manor Farm that have been converted. And the entrance was there where Jackie's built her house, right in the middle. That was the entrance into the yard. But you've got to go at it now through Eddystone Close-Up in the back to get in. So all the barn, not even a barn has been spared. They're all converted now. The next house on there is where Jackie Truscott lives. That is the original chapel, built in 1834. It's got the date on the wall. And all the local people sent their carts to pick up sand from the beach and do all sorts to build it. I've seen the bills in the record office. And that one could seat about 30, well, it had, in 1850 they did a survey and he had 30 people Sunday mornings and 39 Sunday afternoons, he said. So that was...
How many people were living here then?
Well...
40.
Probably. Yeah. I don't know how many were there then. So anyway, these are the barns that belong to Prince's farm, and Prince is nothing to do with the Prince. It was Prins, P-R-Y-N-N-S, Prins, the name of the man who had it. And they used to call the tenements, usually were called by the name of the man who had it last before them. So you know, if it was Taylor's, it was after Taylor, they named it Taylor's. So that was how things went in those days. So there's some big barns here. The Prince's farm was quite a big farm, and the Gileses, well, the Wilsons were here early on in the 1800s. Mr. Wilson was the son-in-law of Mr. Anthony that built my house, and they had an argument over when they built my house, and it went on for 20 years, and he didn't do a very good job because the roof went and the water came in.
Robert, can I just ask, you might have said it already, so I'm going to test it. Are all these barns and villages, these houses, how many barns?
Well, all of them, but they've changed a bit because they remodel them, don't they? And they make them a bit higher and they alter the roof a bit. But basically, they're on the footprint because you were allowed to, convert the footprint of your barn. So that's what's happened. So there's several here at Prince's. There was, if you look on the old maps, there was a big duck pond here. So that was the gate there, and the pond was just in there.
That's it. On the other side of this wall, you can see something.
Remains of the pond.
I don't know.
They've just been digging it out over the weekend.
Yeah. Every farm had a pond because if you were ploughing with horses, they had feathers on their feet. And the last thing at night, when you've been ploughing or working them, was to wash their feathers. Otherwise they'd get mud fever. So they always had a pond to walk the horse in and so forth.
Oh, well, what would they been keeping in these barns then? Would it just be wheat or straw for the cattle or what?
Yes, there would be. They used to keep a lot of bullocks and keep them tied in all the time and feed them mangel wurzels and turnips. Yeah. We can go in around and see the farmhouse if you like, because Andy and...
He's gone out.
They've gone out. Well, that's all right. They won't mind them, will they? Can we go around the front this way? The Giles family home, and Captain Giles was ex-army, and he was church warden for a long time, and he ruled the roost in Wembury really for a long time, and before them it was the Wilsons, and the Giles family came from Yampton and settled into Page's farm at the other end, and this farm came up for sale. And Mr. Giles bought it under the nose of Mr. Wilson, and they never spoke again so the Wilsons had to move from here into Pages where the Giles came out of. So Rita was just saying the feud was still going on when she came here. there's a little annex out the back, and Mrs. Wilson that lived here, she had a brother, Orlando, and he was not quite well in the head. And there's a little room out with steps, and I'm sure that's where he used to live. They had to look after him. So we'll move on now you've had a look. Now we're in Taylor's farm yard. It's now called Stadden Court. It belongs to my friend George and Vernon Stadden that have moved up to Worcestershire. I think the barns have some of them been sold off, but they still own the house, and the house is divided into cottages. And it's quite a big house. It comes right round the corner, but it's a very old house, and that was where Mr. Taylor lived. And I'm not sure how the Taylors came to own this bit of ground, but they classed themselves as gentlemen, and they owned about 30 or 40 acres in Down Thomas, and they leased a lot as well. They had a lot of leases. And years ago, if you leased land, it was usually for 3 lives or 99 years. So when the 3 lives were nearly up, Mr. Taylor decided to take himself off to Bath, and he took the family and they went to live at Ditteridge, in just over the border into Wiltshire, I think it is, but quite close to Bath. And so he became a gentleman up that way. So apart from one daughter who had been naughty and got in the family way with the workman, and he disowned her, and she eventually, she had a couple of children. She couldn't get married until she was 21 because her husband was underage as well. So eventually, when they were 21, they got married in Stoke Damrell, and they ended up at Oreston. And I know the family that are still there. And he had pilot boats, and he did very well. He had some sons, and they had pilot gigs to go out and direct the shipping into Plymouth. So that was what happened to them. There was another little girl called Elizabeth Taylor. In 1720, they had an outing to the Mewstone, and we're not quite sure why, in April, so it could have been for seagulls' eggs or something, I don't know. Anyway, it was all ages. It wasn't just children or old people. It was all ages. Anyway, the boat tipped up, and about 13 or 14 were drowned. And amongst them was little Elizabeth Taylor, who was aged 11, I think. And she's got a headstone inside the church. If you go in the church, just around the corner on your right, as you go in, behind the door, is a little thing in the floor to Elizabeth Taylor. That's the only memorial I know in Wembury Church to the Taylors. They were a bit of a lively crowd. They didn't tend to get married until they were sort of in their 40s or 50s, and then they find some young girl and marry her. And Francis Taylor was here, and he married this girl Adams, and he also had her sister come to live as well. So he had a child with the sister as well as his wife. That seems to be the common thing for Down Thomas at that time. So the Lindens, who were in Manor Farm across the road, they were a bit weird as well, because he got married a second time to Mrs. Lakeman from Modbury, and she had 2 sons and a daughter, and then there was babies appeared, probably from the daughter, I should imagine, because the mother was too old. So there was all sorts going on. But if you were a yeoman farmer with a bit of sway, you could do what you like in those days, I guess. So what can I say about Taylors, apart from they've been converted, and that looks like the pigs' houses down there. You can still see the pigs' houses. They usually have the pigs' houses near the kitchen so that the waste goes out and feeds the pigs. And the Taylors started there, and then they moved here, and they took over a lot of land, and they were farming, about half of Down Thomas at one time. And then they took off to Bath, and then somebody turned up once, and he was the agent for Mr. Mills, the MP. What was the Peter Mills, the MP. He had this agent, and he was called Taylor, and he was descended from the Taylors. And he was telling me that when they came to sell the farm, they couldn't produce the deeds, which is a bit odd, isn't it? So they didn't get the full price, and a chap called Soddy bought it, and then it went to Mr. Milton, who was a butcher at Stoke Damerel, and it was let then until later on, when the Stadden family firm, they were at Goosewell, they bought it, and it became Stadden Court. And the land with Stadden Court runs down that way on the left-hand side of Mannerbourne Road. So the nice valley bit where we see the sheep grazing, that is the land belongs with Taylors. And they've got a bit down the back now, and they've extended, they bought what was behind Mrs. Persley's farm as well. So they own the little fields behind here, and most of what's down Mannerbourne on the left. That's what goes with this farm. So that is still being farmed. So and I guess the land of Prince is still being farmed by Nick Giles. No, not Nick Giles. Gus Giles. Generation now. Yeah, Gus Giles lives at Home Farm, and he's a nice young chap. So we'll press on and do a bit more down the road. Here we are. This is Star Garage, or where Star Garage was. And this house has been built on the side of the garage. Star Garage was started by Mr. Newton, and Mr. Newton came here. He came to Wembury to be the chauffeur for Dr. Clay at Wembury House, and then Dr. Clay died suddenly, and Mr. Newton was out of a job, and he had nowhere to live for his family. He had a week's notice to get out, and so he came over here, and he put the family in behind Mr. Avery's boot shop, cobbler shop. He had a tin hut in the back of his house by Page's farm, and they settled in there for a while, and then he managed to buy this bit of ground and built a wooden bungalow, army hut, I think, just there where that house is there now. And then the family lived in there, and he started the garage, and then he had a little bus service that he started, and it was the Red Star bus service, and he did very well for a while. And then later on his sons ran the garage for a while. There were still petrol pumps outside when I was young, ready to use, but they've long gone now. And so now we'll move on to the Mussel Inn. Here we are at the Mussel Inn, and it's only actually been a pub since about 1850, and before that it was known as Hinkston's Tenement, and it's always been fairly well maintained because it was where the steward of the manor lived for Mr. Carmody. His steward was Mr. Hinkston, so it became Hinkston's Tenement, and it was a little farm tenement like all the others along here. But then it became the pub in about 1850, and there's an old picture that you can see what it was like when it was thatched, and you can see the old barn thatched on the end here that's falling down. And of course the road was a lot narrower then, and there was May's tenement was across the road, and must have been nearly in the road, and that was another old tenement cottage inn that was falling down. In the survey, Langdon survey, it was in a really bad state, so I guess it was pulled down eventually. But within its courtlage was the village well, where people could get water from, and we can still see over there is where the village pump was put, getting water from the well. So Mr. Newton, when he was there with his family opposite, he would have to cross the road to get the water from the well for the village pump. when this 1850 became a pub, it became called the New Inn. And over at Wembury side, Knighton, we had the Old Inn before it became the Jubilee, and now the Odd Wheel, but that was the Old Inn, so this was the New Inn over here. And several families had it. They started with the Taylor family, and then it went into the Hurrells. Servington Hurrell was the landlord, and a couple of generations, I think, and there was the Wells, I think, probably all related. And I believe it was Wilcox's when I was young, running the pub. So it's a really old building. It's one of the original sort of Devon longhouses, but of course it's not been a pub for that many years. We're here in the car park of the Muscle, and next door is Spring Cottage, and that's another old tenement. As you can see, it's another sort of Devon longhouse going down the hill, and the animals would have been in the lower side and people lived in the higher side. This was Mr. Taylor in Taylor's Farm. He leased this tenement. I think it was Foster's tenement, and he leased several tenements, and they became known as Taylor's leasehold. And when later on, when Taylor's became Taylor's, originally it was Lee's before that, and this became Lee's later on as a little farm. But when, of course, in 1876 the farms were all divided up, these two little old tenements here lost their land, so the land went with the bigger farms. We'll go down the end and then we can have a good look at Gabbard in the end up there, and that's Yolland Wood there. And Mr. Matt Bean told me that once he sold Yolland Wood to somebody who came along, but they never claimed it, so then he had it back again. Yeah, so that's been the Matt Bean's farm for quite some time. Originally it wasn't a farm at all, it was just part of Robert Baker had some of the land, and it was Baker's Gabber, but there was no farm there. And there was cottages that belonged to Mr. Spurrell. But in, as I was saying, the comedies came back, and Mr. Hook, James Hook, had been living in the back of Langdon Court for quite a while, and he was getting old. He lived to be 92, 91 or 92. And he was like the matriarch, or no, patriarch of the family. And he decided to buy a bit of ground off Mr. Spurrell, and he built Gabber farmhouse and the barn in front. And then the comedies bought it back after he died. But the Hooks came here in about 1710. First of all, it was James Hook, and he built the little linny that's down, well, I don't think it's there anymore. If you know where the sewage works are on Wembury Cliffs, up past Langdon Beach, up the valley there was a little linny. And I've seen somewhere that James Hook built that in 1720. He said, oh, things are doing well down here, so he sent for his nephew, James, another James. So that was the old man who died at 92, was the nephew. And then his son was living in Farm Barton over there. So several generations. And of course, you know, you do well farming and you educate your family. And then they end up being surgeons, and they changed their name to De La Hook because they went up market, I guess. And so the De La Hook, the surgeon, has got a plaque in Wembury Church. But it was just a period, and the Antonys who built my house came over our side and took over all the land from the Elm right up to, you know, Train. They had it all, and West Wembury Farm. And Mr. Hook did the same over here. Gradually all the little small holdings and tenements were included in his land holding, and he pretty much had everything this side of the parish. And I've got two little grandsons who, if you jiggle around a bit on their ancestry through their grandmother, you get back to that family, which I thought was a bit weird. Anyway.
The Anthony's, related to the Anthony House in Cornwall?
Sorry?
Are the Anthonys related to the Anthony House?
Oh, no, nothing to do with them. No. They used to pronounce it Anthony, so I was told by one of the descendants. Anthony. Anyway, yes, we're not talking about them because they're the wrong side of the parish. We're talking about the Hooks. And the last, two Miss Hooks ended up living in a house which is gone, but it was down where Jim Wilson's chalet park is, down Boverson, on the cliff. And there's a nice picture of Boverson Lodge, and you can just see this cottage on the skyline, which is gone. Yeah, Gabber runs on that side of the valley, so that is Langdon, whereas this side of the valley is Down Thomas. And there is a field down there called Mill Ditch, and then you're wondering if it's called Mill Ditch, was there ever a Down Thomas mill? But if there was, it's long gone. And the river that runs down the valley here is called Gabber Lake.
Gabber Lake?
Gabber Lake.
What, is that a hay? Is that goes to Haybrook Bay?
It goes to Haybrook Bay, so when it becomes the Haybrook, I have no idea.
The hay, yeah, because of the Gabber Lake and the hay, yeah. I thought Gabber was mentioned in the Domesday book with Philip de Gabber. There was a knight who had it in the 10...
There may well have been, but there was no farm as such there, because it was all...
He just had a portrait or a
Yeah, I mean, things change over the, you know, he could have been, couldn't he?
1,000 years.
Who knows? Yeah.
Coming to us.
I'm pretty good on the 1700s, but before then, because I've looked at the church records, and we've got very good church records in Wembury, all for what they collected for the poor, what people paid, how much land they had, and really good if anybody wanted to do any research. The old maps, it says this is called Kames Lane, but I've never known it, but it's called Manorborn now. I guess the chap who did the development at Manorborn, it became known as Manorborn. We stood here, well, years ago, if you looked down there, you would have seen a great big round semicircular garage that was Mr. Hart's bus station for his buses, keeping his buses. And then Peggy Hart lived in the house next door. I don't know which side it was now, that side or that side? That side, yeah, that side. Yeah, that one's gone. Now, Rita was correcting me about Tom Hart, saying that he came here and he bought Mr. Stansel out, because it was the Stansels who started the development of Haybrook Bay, and the pub, the Eddystone, was their home, and there was a big family of them with lots of children, and the girls used to do riding and for the holiday camp. And I guess as they got older and did their own thing, Mr. Stansel sold off the holiday camp. And Tom Hart thought that if he had the bus service, he could bus people to his holiday camp. But because the war came, it never happened. That was what was going on. And
You talk about the current somehow that's still...
sorry?
You talk about the current somehow that's still around?
John Hart.
Oh,
Yeah, Rita's husband, John Hart. Yeah. Yeah, Tom Hart is his dad. Yeah. Yeah, Mr. Stansel laid out this plan, and he was going to develop the whole of Wembury Point and Haybrook Bay, and he had these roads going around, and that's why you've got 3 or 4 cottages at the top of what they call West Hill, which is nowhere near anything else, at Wembury Point. And it would have been all houses right on the coast of the cliff, and it never happened because, you know, the war came and what have you. And so that but there's still, you know, it's built some houses, hasn't it? So there were some houses already there, and then they've infilled a lot of them since. So it just sort of started it off, the development of Haybrook Bay. Cole's Cottages. Now it was called Cole's Close, that field originally, and as I mentioned before, the Coles had the original manor farm in the manor of Down Thomas. They had the lordship of the manor, and then they sold it to the Tolwich family, But I guess you wouldn't want Cholwich cottages because it would be a job to spell it. So we'll move on a bit around the corner. This was called Farm Barton, or Barton Farm, or Court Barton. It was belonged to the Spurrell family, and Mr. Spurrell, John Spurrell, was a butcher in Stoke Damrell, made a lot of money, started buying up land, and he bought Farm Barton and Pages in 1765. Going back a bit further, there was the Langdon, the comedies at Langdon, and Mr. Ryder was in Ranley, and he wanted him out, so he let him have this side, Farm Barton. So the Ryders came over here. The Ryders came to Wembury with the dissolution of the monasteries, and the abbot at Plimpton Priory was giving out all these leases to get some money before they chucked him out, and he let the Ryders have Wembury Manor. So they were the yeoman farmers. So they were the yeoman farmers over there, and then they gradually came this way. They went to West Wembury Farm for a while, the Ryders, and they originally came from Beer Alston way, and they ended up here. Francis Ryder was a gentleman, and I think he had a nice house here somewhere, and it could be somewhere in that vicinity. Mr. Rhodes, who used to live there, called me over to show me some interesting bit of granite he found in his garden. It looked like the remnants of probably some old house. So there could have been a house here for Francis Ryder. And there is, if you go in here, I used to rent these fields here, and if you go down there, there's a proper drive going through that field with like drainage ditches and everything, and a real hard drive, but it just goes nowhere. It goes down to the bottom and then it disappears. So whether it did continue on, and perhaps Mr. Ryder had it as a driveway into his house here, because he was certainly a posh gentleman. The only plaque in the church is one in the vestry on the wall to his daughter when she died. That's his daughter, Francis Ryder, gent. And when he died, he left his land here to Phineas Harwood. But the problem was Phineas Harwood died just before he did. So then the next brother down decided that he should inherit it. So it was a court case because another nephew called John Polson, or Polexfen, he thought he could have a go at it. Anyway, the Harwood stayed on here, and there's big plaques in the floor of the church in the south aisle to the Harwood family. And one of the daughters married the vicar, Reverend Perry, and they're all in the floor of the church. So it stayed with the Harwoods until 1765. Then it was sold to John Spurrell, who sold it to the Bastards of Kitley in 1814. And the Bastards owned a lot of land over Stadiscombe and right down the valley. And then they took on land in Down Thomas as well. So Page's farm was belonged to Kitley at one time. So if you can imagine, in the back there is the farmhouse. We'll go in and have a look in a minute. And these cottages have been built on the front. And the end cottage there used to be the village post office, the pink one. And the Pursleys came here, and Mrs. Pursley lived in that house with her daughter, Mrs. Rossiter. The Pursleys built that house and called it Court Barton, and then the court got added on to the Farm Barton. So where is Linda with the pictures? There you are. I've got a few more pictures just to show you. This is old Mr. Pursley on top of his hayrick. This is Mr. Pursley with his old bull.
Is that John Rossiter then?
No, he's his dad. No, his
I
granddad.
was going to say
Oh,
granddad.
the little boy might be. Yeah, could be.
John. It looks a
Could be
bit
John.
like it. Yeah.
And this is Jim Pursley, that was church warden and farmed here. And there he is on his tractor. That was the last farmer to farm the farm here, really.
It is, Jim.
And he died on a very hot day. They were doing haymaking, weren't they?
John was with him.
Yeah, John Hart was with him, and he just
Down
collapsed.
that field, over there.
Which
Over
field?
that field.
Oh, over there.
It was facing down.
Yeah.
And they'd come in for tea, and Archie, Jim had been driving, and he said to Archie, "You drive, I'll stack."
Yeah.
Really good job, because if he'd have been driving when he had
He
his
would
heart
have
attack,
gone down over the hill. Yeah.
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 Yeah, he was church warden for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So there was a good old boy called Archie Walk, lived in one of these cottages,
That one.
and he was a Devonshire boy, but he had some stories, and he always used to come out and help when we were moving the bullocks in here. He used to help Mrs. Pursley, and he could tell you a few tales. Yeah, one of his family was in the square over at Wembury side, and he was a little lad, and the bus came in, and it had a rack going up the back, ladder up the back, when they used to put cases on the top, and the little lad was climbing up the ladder, and the bus went back and killed him. It was quite sad. But there was lots of walks, and the walks, the good old Wembury family walks and aviaries and horns. Yeah. So there's one more in there in a minute when we get around the corner. So what we're going to do, it's a bit of a squeeze. We're going to go in there, up the steps past the post office, through the alleyway, and you can see the courtyard in the back with the old village pump, or the pump for the cottages. And then we're going in the garden at the back, and then you can see the old farmhouse along the back. Because it's hidden away, but it's a good water supply. You only got to go down a little way and you've got a really good water supply. So they've all got wells. Something must have happened in 1854, because Mr. Matthews, who farmed at Manor Farm, he died of the cholera, and 3 days later his wife died of the cholera as well. So they must have had a cholera outbreak here then. So I don't know if that doesn't come from very good drainage, does it? We're going to squeeze through there. Brought you in here just to show you the back of the house, because that would be the original farmhouse. And I can imagine that when Mr. Cock was milking all these cows at Ranley, and he farmed all this as well, he would have had all those cottages useful for all these workmen, because they all had to be housed somewhere close by. This was the original farmyard next door with all the pigs' houses and everything, and of course there's a new house built in there, and quite recently, I don't know where the pigs' houses are still there, I can't see. There we go. Quiet at the moment. Whale Cottage used to be the blacksmith shop, and the Simmons family that were over at Knighton, they married into the Colemans and became the Colemans at Knighton Smithy, but the Simmons that came over here remained Simmonses, and he called himself a whitesmith as well as being a blacksmith. So I'm not sure, what would you make, pewter if you were a whitesmith perhaps? Anyway, the family lived here, and his wife was the village schoolmistress, and she ran a little school. That was in the sort of 1850s, 60s. There we go. The last Mrs. Pursley, they've made that their farmhouse in there, and her mother-in-law lived in the Court Barton farmhouse in the big house. This house here was built by Jim Wilson. He was the farmer here for a long, long time at Pages, and he started the shallow part down at Overson Beach on the end of his fields. He was at the end of the Wilsons. The Wilsons were here for generations and generations, and there was two families, and one, the one over the end in Prince's farm, they were just Wilsons, but Jim's family were called Curry Wilson, and the Curry goes back to the miller on Wembury Beach was called Curry, and the male line died out, and all the daughters put Curry in their children's names, so there's Curry Avants and Curry Wilsons, and you can see them on the church gravestones. They always put the Curry in. So there's a couple of cottages here and some cottages up there, and one of them was belonged to Langdon, and one group belonged to Mr. Spurrell, but I'm not sure which was which at the moment. And I've got a picture to show you when we get a bit further up. This picture here is the Avery family, taken outside the cottage, and there I think the end cottage, where he had his boot and shoe repairers in the back, and you can still see the sign outside, so if you like to pass that one away. Winnow the corn and that, and the old horse would go round and round in circles, and they could use it for anything they like, you know, crushing apples or what, just to make a bit of machinery. This is Page's farmyard, and Jim Wilson was the last farmer to farm it, and now it's all gone to nice cottages. But you can still, it's a nice enclosed yard, you can still get the feel of how it was, full of animals. And that's the farmhouse there, and it's got a double pitch on it, so I think the oldest part is the piece in the back, and this has been added on later. I think it's now two houses. So we're just going to walk along the road a little bit and show you something when we can see the sea. When they built the forts, they built in 1870, they called them Palmerston's Follies, and they built them all around Plymouth. And when they built the one over there at Staden Heights, they wanted to have a clear view of anybody coming up this way. So they took all the hedges down, so that's why there's no hedges in Down Thomas over this side or around Staden Heights. And all these metal posts date from that time. And they all took the hedges down and put up all this fencing. And it's nearly coming to the end, but some places you can still see it. And they did great big, for gateways, they did great big things. I had to try and pull one out once, and they go down really deep with platforms and the devils to move once they're in. Of course, they'd all be too narrow gateways for modern farming. And the breakwater was started in 1814, and Mr. Whidbey came to manage the building, and he was ex-Navy, and he'd been discovering the world on board ships, and there's an island named after him off Vancouver Island called Whidbey Island, and he built Boverson Lodge and lived there until 1830 when he retired, and he went to live at Taunton, and his grave is up when you see the cricket coming from Taunton and you see the church in the background. His grave is somewhere on the path to the cricket ground. Well, I've not been to see it yet. Anyway, that was Joseph Whidbey, and he built the breakwater with John Rennie, and then when he died it was his son John Rennie carried on, because the breakwater took from 1814 to 1844 before they had it and they wanted it, and then of course they've still been repairing it ever since. And my father used to go out from Pomfleet Creek on the boats that used to maintain it, and he'd go out there and play all day on the breakwater and run up and down and climb in that thing on the end to save the shipwrecked mariners. So after Mr. Whidbey at Boverson Lodge, the Rodney family came in. Rodney is descended from Admiral Rodney, and I knew his great-grandson who used to live in Nighton Hill, and his grandson used to be a friend of my son. So I've seen all the family tree from Mr. Rodney, and he had a lot of children, but only one produced any offspring. And he was down there a long time, and his wife was a sister to the Bastard family at Kitley. So they were first cousins to the Bastards. So I guess they had the house rent-free, probably didn't pay much rent, because Mr. Rodney was always hard up, never had any money. And so after the Rodneys, the Bulteels were there for a while, and different people farmed it down there. But now the house is still there, and it's all been restored and looking nice. But the farm buildings have gone. And there's a big reservoir over there. I don't know if you've known there's a reservoir for the Navy. They used to water the ships from the end of the pier at Fort Boversand, down at the bottom. And the water was piped right to the end of the pier for them to fill up for their ships. And there's a big reservoir just down there in the valley, opposite from the house. And the water comes from all the valley, and the fields this side that belong to Farm Barton have got on the deeds that the water's got to be kept free to run to this reservoir. And it's a big reservoir, and it's all lined with stone, it's built properly. And then there was a channel that took it out to the quay, and then later it was piped. So sometimes when there's a rock fall on the cliff, you can see the channel that they built, and you can see the pipe going through. So that pretty much concludes our tour of Down Thomas today. I hope you've enjoyed it and learnt a bit of the history, and thank you all for listening.